Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you've given us and we really dig in.
Try and get our heads around them fast, yeah.
Exactly. And today, we're tackling something that feels, well, just fundamentally puzzling, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Why on earth do people actually want to watch things, seek out experiences that are specifically made to scare them or shock them or even disgust them?
Right. It goes way back. You mentioned David Hume talking about that. Like, unaccountable pleasure we get from things that should feel bad.
Yeah.
Disagreeable passions, he called them.
Yeah, exactly. So that's our mission today, basically. We're diving into the sources you sent. We've got psych papers, reviews, blogs, discussions.
A real mix, yeah. All trying to get at this strange phenomenon, the enjoyment of horror films, trying to understand the psychology.
Right. And the sources start by sort of trying to pin down what horror even means here.
Yeah.
They admit the boundaries are kind of fuzzy.
Totally.
But generally, horror involves, like, gore, mutilation maybe, the supernatural, darkness, confronting the unknown, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, which separates it usually from a straightforward thriller, which might be more about human suspense.
Oh, so you get those overlaps, right? Like the sources mention Reservoir Dogs. That ear scene feels pretty horrific.
Oh, absolutely. But you wouldn't really call the whole film horror. The intent feels different.
Okay.
And even within horror, the definitions aren't set in stone. Some scholars, like Carroll, focused on the monster, something that breaks the rules of nature or science.
But that leaves things out, surely.
Well, yeah, critics pointed that out. Like, what about slashers with human killers?
Yeah.
Or even Psycho? Carroll apparently didn't see that as pure horror because the killer was, all too human.
Huh. Interesting.
So the sources seem to lean towards defining horror less by a strict checklist and more by its goal, to scare you, disturb you, using certain kinds of recognizable tropes.
Got it. It's about the feeling it aims for and the techniques it uses. So let's start right there. How do these films actually make us scared? What are the, fundamental tools?
Well, according to these sources, one of the biggest, most reliable tools is sound.
Sound design.
And specifically, the jump scare.
Right. The classic sudden loud noise. My heart's speeding up just thinking about them.
See? That's the effect. It's often, a really loud sound suddenly bursting out after quiet. Sometimes it's not even linked to what you're seeing. It's just pure auditory shock.
Or it comes with a sudden visual, like the monster in the mirror trick.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And the sources make this important distinction between diegetic sound stuff the characters can hear, like dialogue, a door creaking, and non-diegetic sound, stuff added just for us, the audience. Music, sound effects.
And horror uses that non-diegetic sound so effectively, maybe more than any other genre.
Oh, powerfully. Yeah. I mean, think of the examples the sources pull out. Bernard Herrmann's violins in Psycho. That screeching.
Instantly recognizable, chilling.
Totally. Or John Williams in Jaws, just two notes on a double bass, meaning imminent death. John Carpenter's synth score in Halloween, those little stings.
Yeah.
The tubular bells in The Exorcist. Or that creepy choir in The Omen.
All iconic sounds of fear.
And there's that great story about Carpenter showing Halloween without the score. And apparently, an executive just wasn't scared. Carpenter said he knew he had to save it with music.
Wow. So the music wasn't just enhancing the fear, it was basically creating it in that case.
Seems like it, yeah. So when these sudden loud sounds or these really unnerving scores hit us, what's actually happening in our bodies?
Right, physiologically.
It triggers what's called the startle response. It's automatic. You can't really help it.
Okay.
Your heart pounds, breathing gets shallow, maybe changes rhythm, your muscles all tense up. You might literally jump or flinch.
That sounds pretty unpleasant when you describe it like that. Why does our body react that way?
It's evolution. Deep, deep wiring. It's like an instant threat detector.
Okay.
Out in the wild, a sudden loud noise. Could be a predator pouncing, a tree falling. Immediate danger. You need to react instantly. No time to think.
Like a reflex.
Exactly. And it's also tied to protective stuff, like how we react instantly to a baby crying.
So our ancient survival brain kicks in before our modern rational brain even gets a look in.
That's absolutely key. The sources explain the brain pathways. The route for immediate emotional reactions like fear through the amygdala. It's way faster than the route to the prefrontal cortex.
The thinking part.
The thinking, analyzing part. So that initial shock, that jolt to fear, you feel it before your higher brain can even process, oh, wait, it's just a movie.
Your body screams danger while your conscious mind is still buffering, trying to tell it to calm down.
Pretty much, yeah. And your prefrontal cortex can learn to sort of override or dampen that amygdala response if you really expect a scare. But that takes effort, cognitive load.
So if you're already stressed or really focused, like in a scary video game, maybe?
Right. That suppression is harder because scare hits you harder because your brain's busy.
And this whole involuntary physical thing, the racing heart, the tense muscles, holding your breath, that's a huge part of the feeling of watching horror, isn't it? This high state of arousal.
It really is.
Yeah.
Which, brings us right back to the main puzzle. Why would we choose to feel that? Why deliberately put ourselves in that state of, frankly, discomfort?
Right, the big why. If it feels bad physiologically, why does it also feel good, or at least compelling for so many people?
Okay, so now we get into the psychological theories.
Yeah.
And a really big part of the experience is suspense.
The buildup.
Yeah, that growing tension, that awful feeling that something terrible is about to happen. The sources define it as fearful apprehension about deplorable events. It's the not knowing.
Which can feel bad or good.
Well, that's the thing. It can be noxious, as one source puts it, or surprisingly pleasant, depending on the situation.
Fearful apprehension being pleasant. Okay, yeah, that's the core paradox right there.
So one major theory that tries to explain this, particularly for films that, have a resolution at the end, is Zillman's excitation transfer theory.
Okay, what's the gist?
The basic idea is that all that negative arousal, the fear, the tension, the suspense that builds up while you're watching, it doesn't just vanish when the threat is over. It gets sort of tacked onto whatever emotion you feel after the resolution.
So if you feel relief at the end,
that relief feels way more intense, maybe even euphoric, because it's got all that leftover fear energy mixed into it.
Yeah.
But if there's no resolution, you're just left feeling bad, dysphoric.
And if you know the bad ending is coming,
then it's not really suspense anymore, it's dread, which usually isn't fun.
Okay, so the worse the scare, the bigger the payoff of relief, potentially.
That's the core idea. Now, the sources do say the empirical evidence for this is a bit limited. Some studies found hints of it, like one from way back in '75 with kids watching cartoons. They liked the ones with more suspense if the hero won. But that direct link between feeling scared and then liking the film more because of the relief, it doesn't seem to explain everything, especially films that don't have neat, happy endings.
Right, so resolution might be part of it for some films or some people, but it's not the whole story. What else is going on? Why else do people seek this stuff out?
Oh, there's plenty more, according to the sources. A lot seems to come down to personality, individual differences.
Personality, like some people are just wired differently.
Seems like it, yeah, to a pretty significant degree. One really key trait is sensation seeking.
Okay, what's that?
It's basically a drive for experiences that are novel, complex, intense, maybe even a bit risky. People high on this trait, they're much more likely to enjoy horror.
Why? Because the feeling itself is rewarding.
Exactly. They actually find that intense physical arousal, even if it's triggered by something technically negative, like fear stimulating. It feels good to them. They're the classic adrenaline junkies.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. They're not trying to avoid the feeling, they're actively chasing it.
Precisely. And another related trait the sources mention is morbid curiosity.
Morbid curiosity. Sounds about right.
Yeah, it's described as a stable personality difference. A genuine fascination with darker, often taboo subjects. Things like death, violence, the grotesque, dangerous people, crime. And the research suggests a link between having this curiosity and enjoying horror films. It might be a safe way to explore these unsettling parts of life that you wouldn't or couldn't engage with otherwise.
Like scratching an itch about the darker side of things, but safely?
Kinda, yeah. There's also a mention of lower agreeableness, sometimes correlating with horror enjoyment, but the sources say that link is less consistent, needs more research.
Okay. So, beyond who likes it, are there actual psychological benefits? Does watching scary movies actually do anything positive for us?
The sources suggest some really interesting possibilities there. One idea is that horror can function as a kind of coping mechanism, almost like anxiety rehearsal.
Anxiety rehearsal, how does that work?
By watching really extreme fictional horrors, some people apparently feel better about their own, everyday problems by comparison. There was a quote in one source about it helping to balance and control the everyday doom.
Yeah, I can see that. My commute was bad, but at least I'm not being chased by zombies.
Exactly. It gives perspective. And, maybe more importantly, experiencing those strong emotions, fear, disgust, anxiety, but in a completely controlled, safe, fictional setting. That can actually be beneficial.
How so?
It lets you learn that these feelings, even though they're uncomfortable, aren't actually going to harm you. They're not inherently bad or unmanageable. It's like a chance to practice staying calm, regulating your own reaction, tolerating distress.
With like an emotional workout, training your regulation skills.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah.
You have total control watching a movie. You know it's not real. You could pause it, look away, turn it off.
Right.
And you also see characters dealing with terrifying situations. Sometimes they overcome them. That might give you new ways to think about your own fears, maybe.
That ties into this idea of playing with fear, doesn't it? Or recreational fear, like haunted houses or escape rooms.
Exactly. Engaging with things that are moderately scary, but in a context where you know you're ultimately safe, it could potentially build resilience.
And the sources even go a bit deeper, almost philosophical, suggesting this safe confrontation lets people think about really tough stuff, pain, mortality, death, in a way that's manageable. They reference thinkers like Russell and Kafka.
Yeah, this idea that grappling with darkness, even through entertainment, might lead to some kind of personal insight or a better understanding of, the human condition.
What about catharsis? That's a word that always comes up with horror.
Definitely. Catharsis gets discussed. The theory, which goes way back to Aristotle, even Burke, is basically that experiencing intense fear and anxiety through the film allows you to kind of release your own pent-up versions of those emotions.
Like letting off steam.
Leading to relief or maybe emotional processing afterwards. That's the classic idea.
I sense a butt coming.
Well, yeah. The sources are careful here. There's a lot of debate about catharsis, especially when it comes to violence. There's really not much good evidence that watching violence makes people less aggressive.
Right. Might even do the opposite for some people.
Exactly. So the focus in these sources, when they talk about catharsis in horror, it seems to be more about releasing fear and anxiety rather than aggression.
Okay, so maybe less about purging violent impulses and more about processing tension and fear itself? Is that the angle?
That seems to be where the research is looking, yeah. And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. The unexpected, but apparently deep link between fear and humor.
Humor. In horror movies, how does that fit in?
So the sources talk about this fascinating cognitive connection.
Yeah.
Humor often happens when something first hits you as a violation, like a sudden scare or something really gross. But then you almost immediately reappraise it as being ultimately benign, harmless.
Because you know it's fake.
Exactly. The context, you're safe. It's a movie. And that psychological distance helps you make that switch. Threat. Oh, wait. No threat. Benign.
Okay. So you get scared, then instantly realize you're okay, and that switch can trigger laughter.
That's the theory. And when you make that benign appraisal, your brain apparently releases feel-good chemicals, dopamine, opioids. They lower stress, and they actually encourage you to sort of playfully explore the thing that just scared you. Laughter itself is kind of a play signal.
Wow, think about nervous laughter after a jump scare.
Precisely. Or dark humor moments in a really tense film. It seems like it's a built-in way our brains have to regulate fear.
So it's like a relief valve, but also a reward signal for figuring out it wasn't really dangerous.
That seems to be it. And the sources even suggest this fear-humor link might be more than just interesting psychology, potentially a treasure trove of new therapeutic practices. The idea being that consciously finding the benign in things that feel threatening could be a powerful way to manage anxiety.
So facing fear in a safe place, especially if you can laugh about it afterwards, is literally training your brain to cope better.
That looks like a key mechanism the research is highlighting, yeah. Practicing that rapid shift from threat perception to benign appraisal.
That is genuinely fascinating. It's way more complex than just chasing an adrenaline rush. It's active cognitive stuff. But the sources also stress this isn't a universal experience, right? There are big individual differences.
Oh, absolutely. And the most consistent, most pronounced difference they discuss is between biological sexes.
Okay.
The findings across multiple studies seem pretty clear. Generally, men and boys report enjoying scary stuff more than women and girls do.
They enjoy it more, and they're less scared by it.
Yeah, they report being less scared, they watch it more often, and they tend to prefer stuff that's more intense, more frightening.
The stats you mentioned from that Harris study sounded pretty dramatic.
They were quite striking, yeah. Among teenagers, something like 31% of the women said they looked away during a scary movie, compared to only 7% of men. And about 80% of women said they were somewhat or very afraid, versus under half, 46% of the men.
Wow.
And women also reported more negative after effects, like trouble sleeping.
That's a huge difference in just the basic experience. Do the sources offer reasons why?
Well, there's an older theory mentioned, Zillman's social comparison theory from the 80s. It suggested that maybe men enjoyed it more with a scared female companion because it made them feel brave or masterful by comparison.
Hmm.
And conversely, women enjoyed it more with a calm, masterful male companion. Kind of like performing gender roles almost.
Playing the protector or the protected.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But, as the sources point out, that doesn't really explain why people watch alone or enjoyment later in life, so it's probably only part of the picture, if that.
And there's also just the social aspect, right? Watching scary movies together.
Yeah, that shared intense experience can definitely build bonds, create a sense of community.
Okay, let's tackle another thing the sources bring up, that common stereotype about horror fans, that they must be less empathetic or something.
Right. That stereotype gets directly challenged by some recent research highlighted in these sources. A new study found that horror fans actually scored just as high on measures of empathy and compassion as people who don't like horror.
So that idea is just wrong. Myth-busted.
According to that study, yeah. In fact, the sources argue empathy is actually essential for horror to even work properly.
How so?
You need to feel for the characters. You have to connect with their fear, their potential suffering, for the threat to feel real or meaningful to you. If you felt zero empathy for the person being chased, why would the monster seem scary?
That makes total sense. You have to care about the potential victim for the danger to have any weight.
Exactly. Now, there's a slight nuance the sources mention. One review suggested that if someone specifically fixates only on the most graphic bits like torture or murder scenes rather than engaging with the whole story, that specific focus might correlate with lower empathy in certain contexts.
Okay, so maybe obsessing over gore purely for gore's sake is different from appreciating the suspense, the atmosphere, the story, the characters.
Precisely. It's a different kind of engagement. And this connects to the whole idea of desensitization.
Ah, right. Becoming numb to it all.
Yeah, the idea that if you're exposed to a lot of media violence, you might become less emotionally responsive, less empathetic maybe, to suffering, both the fake kind and maybe even real-world stuff.
That sounds like a genuine downside. Does watching horror cause desensitization?
Well, the sources frame it as a potential negative effect of heavy media violence exposure in general. And yes, it can happen with horror, especially if the focus is purely on graphic stuff. But they clarify, this doesn't mean horror fans lack basic empathy.
But what does it mean?
It might mean they become less visually shocked by gore over time, or have a less intense emotional spike when they see it, just through sheer repeated exposure. It's more like a numbing to the visceral impact.
Your brain just gets used to seeing simulated carnage.
Kind of. One study linked habitual media violence viewing to more pleasant arousal and less anxious arousal from violent clips. But again, the sources usually discuss this in terms of physiological response, maybe links to aggression, not necessarily a fundamental loss of compassion for others.
Okay, so getting less squeamish about fake blood doesn't automatically mean you care less about actual people.
That seems to be the distinction the research is making. And it's really important to stress, as the sources do, horror is absolutely not for everyone.
Right.
For people who are particularly sensitive or have certain anxiety issues or past traumas, horror films can definitely be harmful. They can increase anxiety, trigger flashbacks, cause nightmares. You have to know yourself.
So definitely not some kind of universal therapy session.
Not at all. The effects are really individual, depends on the person, their history, how they engage with it.
This has been a really fascinating dive, covering a lot of ground. So to try and wrap it up, why do people enjoy scary movies? It's clearly not just one thing.
No, definitely not. The sources paint a really complex picture. It's this weave of physiological arousal that jolt from sound and suspense, mixed with personality traits, like needing high sensation or being morbidly curious. Then there are the psychological payoffs, using it as a safe space to practice coping with fear, maybe getting that cathartic release, that sense of control, and then that whole surprising fear-humor connection, regulating the scare by finding it benign.
And sometimes it's just about sharing the thrill or feeling good about having navigated those intense feelings safely. It sounds like for a lot of fans, it's really not about being sick or twisted. It's more about engaging with fear in a way that's controlled, playful, maybe even helpful sometimes.
Exactly. It taps into really primal responses, but keeps them contained in this fictional playground where you know you're ultimately safe.
Which brings us to the end of our dive, and maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on based on all this. Given these deep, sometimes really counterintuitive links we found in the sources between fear and humor and coping, maybe even personal growth, what does that tell us about human emotions themselves? About our apparent need to sort of play with even the really uncomfortable parts of just being alive?